Managing difficult relationships. That's what we're here to talk about today. I'm delighted to be joined by Deborah McGovern, who's our head of training and consultancy. Why have we decided to look at managing difficult relationships? Well, we've all had them, haven't we? I don't know about you. I've had plenty of difficult relationships at work in the past, and I'm sure I'm going to have some more in the future. And it's a difficult one to manage. How do we do that? How do we use the language of Belbin, or the theory as well of Belbin, to actually help us with that? But before we start, I suppose we need to get a little bit more clarity on what we mean by difficult working relationships. What does it look like? What does it feel like? Deborah.
Well, thank you. I suppose really with difficult relationships, of course, it can come about for all sorts of reasons, but essentially it's about a degree of conflict. And the problem is, I think, that we have an idea of the word conflict and we just think, oh no, it's only a slightly difficult relationship. Yeah. But in fact, conflict, if you look at a definition, it's everything from difference of opinion through to absolute hostility and feuds. So I think really that's what we want to be focusing on, is understanding where that comes from and how sometimes some difficult relationships, and in broader terms, aspects of conflict, can be really, really important. We should value it, because usually that difficulty comes about from us seeing the world from a different perspective. And if I could just pop in, it's a report from about 20 years ago now, I think, of Yen and Mannix. And they were saying that if you really value differences, if you really value conflict, you in fact have a far healthier set of relationships. And in terms of teams, you have the potential anyway for a team which can be much more creative, which can look at those different types of areas of difference that we have.
So what you're saying there, Deborah, is we're looking at managing difficult relationships. The key thing there is managing, isn't it? We're not trying to correct. Mm-hmm. We're not trying to ensure that everybody's hand in hand, skipping along together. What we're trying to do is we are managing those differences that we have in our relationships.
We are. And I think that sometimes, that means almost being controlling, managing it. And therefore, I can manage it if I behave like this and someone else. In fact, to really manage it well, it's about that authenticity and it's about openness. You won't be surprised that, it's about the degree of letting things come up to the surface so they can be looked at, and any differences, any conflict, once it's brought to the surface and you can really understand what it's about, then you've got the potential to manage that, but not just in that confined sense, but in fact to really then potentially have something that's going to be much more positive.
Yeah, absolutely. Because sometimes as well, when we're looking at relationships, they can seem on the surface that they're all hunky-dory and everything's fine, but underneath there's a lot being unsaid sometimes, isn't there?
Completely. And that's what I'm saying. I think a lot of the time it comes down to communication. Yeah, it's about people being open enough. It's about valuing the differences that are there. We know that in fact working with people who are quite different from us and with whom we may really find it quite difficult to work at times, that can be much more positive than just having lots of people who are similar. But I think we'll come on to that.
We'll come to that. Yes, absolutely. So what we'd love to do now over the next 45-ish minutes or so is really look at the language of Belbin and how Belbin can help explore and be that form of communication, that language, that shortcut to have this open dialogue, to have these conversations, to have this clarity. But before we do so, what I need to know is how well everybody here knows Belbin, because either we're going to start up here, down here, we need to make sure that we start in the right place. So I'm just going to launch a poll, if that's okay. So if everybody who's here, if you wouldn't mind just checking, how well do you know Belbin? Not very, you're wanting to learn more. You know the theory, but you don't use the reports. You know the theory and you use the reports, or actually you're a guru, you know everything. And in fact, we're looking forward to your comments in the chat very much. So I'll just wait just a minute or so there. If you wouldn't mind just letting us know, because sometimes we run these webinars and it's very biased one way or the other. We want to make sure that everybody gets something from this session. Okay. Well, this is always difficult. I never know when to press the stop button. I'm relatively high shaper. I get impatient. I'm going to do it now. Okay, so what we have there is that we have about 18% of people who don't know they're wanting to learn more. That's quite a high percentage. Brilliant. Thank you for letting us know. We've got about 35 people who probably know the theory but haven't used the reports. 22% they know the theory and they use the reports. And we've got about a quarter of you who are accredited. So those people that do know, please do come onto the chat and help other people out who perhaps aren't so familiar with the team roles. So what we're going to do is that we are just going to share my screen and we're going to quickly go through these 9 team roles so that we all have at least a basic understanding of the language. So I normally do this behind me on my lovely flip chart, but apparently not everybody can see that. And I've been told to make sure I join this century. So here we have the 9 team roles and what we call the team role circle. Very briefly, we have social roles, action roles, and thinking roles. We'll start here at the enthusiastic resource investigator. And this particular Belbin team role, there's a cluster of behaviours. What they do is they go outside of the organisation, they see how other people are doing it, and then they bring all of those ideas into the organisation. Very opportunistic, they're great negotiators. They've got lots of things on the go. They've got high energy. Their allowable weakness, because every team role has a strength that also has an allowable weakness, is that sometimes they get bored a bit quickly. With the team worker is the team role that cares. It looks at everybody as a human being. They have wonderful empathy, wonderful listening abilities, and they're the ones that care about you. And they do things not for any personal glory, but to help the team. They are the gel that keeps the team together. Their allowable weakness is that sometimes they can be a bit indecisive because they don't want to upset people. The last of those social roles, we have the coordinator, and the coordinator is the one that gives a broad overview. They are the conductor. They know what the music's meant to sound like, and they know how to bring everybody in as and when required. Like I say, they're good at the bigger picture, they're very calm, and they delegate brilliantly. Allowable weakness, sometimes they delegate a little bit too well, and you wonder what on earth they're doing. So they're the social roles. We then have these action roles, roles that get stuff done. And we have the shaper who gets stuff done with lots of energy, quite high anxiety, because they wants to get from A to B as quickly as possible. They're the ones that they're very dynamic. They overcome obstacles. But because sometimes they're a bit focused on the task, their allowable weakness is that sometimes they can upset people, and it's not purposeful. It's just that the task is all important. We then have the completer finisher, and the completer finisher again has high anxiety, and that's just the fact they're perfectionists. They want everything to be absolutely correct. Actually, everything can always be that little bit better. So one could call them a completer polisher, because everything could be, slightly improved. Their allowable weakness is because only they can do as good a job as them. Sometimes they're resistant to delegate somewhat. We then have the implementer, and the implementer is the one that says, yes, okay, enough talk, but what are we actually going to do to make this happen? They're the ones who are very good, very efficient, very practical, and like getting things done in a very systematic way. I also think they have a slight fetish for Excel and Gantt charts, but there we go. Their allowable weakness is the fact that if something works, why change it? So they can be a little bit resistant to change. So they're the action roles. Then we have the thinking roles. We have the specialist, and the specialist is the one with a love of knowledge, a thirst for knowledge, a love of learning, like to really deep dive into a particular subject area. They're the ones that read instruction manuals and use their phones for something other than just social media and being an alarm clock. Their allowable weakness is sometimes they're too deep here to really get that information up into the bigger picture. Monitor evaluators are the ones who are able to look at all of the information, weigh up the pros and cons, and make the right decisions. They are the ones that take the enthusiasm out of the decision-making process. They don't allow their emotions to cloud anything. Their allowable weakness is sometimes they're not the most inspirational, but in a way that's okay. You don't want them to be inspirational, you want them to be right. And then we have the plant. The plant is the one who's incredibly creative, is a great problem solver, comes up with unique solutions to problems. Their allowable weakness is sometimes so much is going on up here that they're not the best at communicating, and sometimes a bit of the, the detail is left. So there we have a very quick overview for everybody who wasn't too sure about what Belbin was, about these 9 different clusters of behavior, these 9 clusters of behavior that we know, which the research has shown, that are critical in making sure a team goes from A to be. There's lots of other behaviors in the workplace, but these were the ones which were identified as being essential for a team to be successful. So a little bit there, Deborah. Whew, I'm going to have a cup of tea now. Over to you.
I'm really impressed with how quickly you can go through those.
Oh, yes.
So what we really want to look at here is which of these behaviours from which these team roles might find that they can have a potentially particularly difficult relationship with another role. Now, I do recognise that difficult relationships can come about from other things. They can come about from a disagreement about the approach of work that is being taken. They can come about from values. They can be to do with the task, different opinion about what the goal is. So we know all of that, but really one of the key areas of difficult relationship is relationship itself. What are differences and potential incompatibilities? So this is what we want you to now think about. You can argue lots of different roles might find that they rub up against another. And in those categories that Jo just talked about, in fact, I might say social, I think more as people. So sort of relationship people roles. But if someone's coming at the world from a people perspective, they're then very likely to find that sometimes the action roles are thinking of really, go about the world, go about their tasks and work in a different way. Likewise, thinking, someone who's thinking. So we would like you, though, to pick out what you think are the most extremes of the actions. And I don't know, how shall we do this? Shall we call out one of the roles and then you say which you think might be the most extreme opposite? So if I start with, which shall we start with? Let's start with shaper. Okay. Now, which of the team roles do you think, so put up in chat, is the most likely to be the extreme opposite? Okay. Yeah. Very good. We've got team worker popping up all the time. You're absolutely right. Now, interestingly, monitor evaluator, someone said, and I think you can argue that quite well, but we take it as the most extreme, in fact, being the team worker. So if you think about this in terms of, if this is different people who have those team roles, what is it that's going to be happening there? We know that the shaper, as Jo was saying, the shaper really cares about just getting it done. It doesn't matter how people feel about this. It doesn't matter, that we check and see if they're all right. We just need to get it done and get it done immediately. So the team worker is likely to be incredibly uncomfortable with that. They may not say it openly, but there's a really difficult potential there because they see the world from such a different perspective. So it's almost like we have a crystal ball, really. We might be able to judge in advance, if we've got people's Belbin team role information there, where there could be difficulties in relationships. So it can help, and especially if you are managing a team or you're working within a team, to actually know that in advance, to have some of those things flagged up can be really useful. So let's look now at...
Actually, Deborah, I'm going to interrupt you. So sorry. I think it's key here. We've got some other team roles as well, like the plant and also the completer finisher, with the opposites of shaper. And I think all of them, it's not a abs and or, is it? I mean, some of these team roles can have several opposites, and perhaps the shaper with such drive is more likely to have a little bit of a clash with some more of those team roles.
Of Completely. And I've seen flashing up on the screen, for instance, that monitor evaluator. Absolutely. You know, you've got the shaper is all about that action, getting it done quickly. Monitor evaluator is about that analysis. Don't rush into things. So you can see again, of course, there could be difficulties. Completer finisher, yeah, they want to take the time focusing on it. But I would say that where you have got roles which are in the same category, so the action, although there might be difficulties there, there's sometimes a little bit more potential for understanding. That's why I said we've gone for the most extreme, not that that's it completely. And I was noticing that someone, or a few people I think, have asked, what about having those, what we call opposite roles within one person? Absolutely, you can have that. And as to whether it's a good thing to have or a bad thing, completely depends on the individual. Because if you've got someone who can kind of integrate those within themselves and they can show the best of both of the roles or both types of roles, then it can be terrific. What you have quite often is someone who has a lot of internal conflict. Which part am I going to show today? And if you, for instance, are managing people, if you're coaches, that's something that you can work with and help people with when you have their own report and you go through that with them.
I'd just like to say, Deborah, I think that the key thing is if you've got it in your top 2 or top 3, you've got one of these opposites, it starts with self-awareness. And knowing that is the first step to then understanding how best to play each role and at which time, isn't it? It's the understanding that you could potentially have, you know, it may not feel completely comfortable all of the time, and therefore being able to put something in place to be able to manage it.
Absolutely. And we have that. I mean, if we're talking about our top roles, which we are here, very much so, it's about knowing which side to bring forward, which is going to be most useful, or which bits of myself do I just try and hold back on in this interaction. So that can be really important. Let's look at, I'm just conscious here, if we now pick up on, what shall we say, what about the plant? So think of which you think would be the most extreme. As we said, it could be lots, but the most extreme opposite of a plant. So we've got, yes, completer, finisher, implementer, and you can argue both of those, certainly. But in fact, we say implementer is likely to be the most extreme. And what you've got there is really quite a lot of potential for misunderstanding, frankly, for disrespecting one another as well. Because what you've got from, say, the plants, they're going to be, even if they don't say it outright, they'll be thinking about the implementer. Oh gosh, always so bureaucratic, or they've always got to just follow the rules. Can't you just be more flexible about this? What the implementer is thinking of the plant sometimes can't be said, but it's like, no, you know, we can't just have all these ideas keep coming through. If we do that, we're not going to get anything done. We need to put some of these things into action. So that's how crystal ball, in a way, coming in again. There is the potential, doesn't mean it will happen, but the potential for real misunderstandings between those two. And we don't just want here to be saying, oh, there's some difficulties. We want you to understand that if people understand themselves, as Joe was saying, that degree of self-awareness, usually something can be done. If both sides can appreciate, they don't have to really want to then go and spend time together in the evenings or whatever, but just have the respect for the difference and to appreciate that the other person is there working in a different way, and that collectively, you know, if you've got the two, they probably can be very complementary for the work being done. So in terms of the effectiveness of the team or of that pair, it's got the potential for that to be great.
And it's that you right at the beginning, you used the word communication, Deborah, and I think that's critical here. I know that when I've been running some workshops, and you can do this as well on Zoom as you can face to face, is everybody has their reports. And I quite like to do a little exercise where you put people who are very different with their top team roles, and they're sitting next to each other with their reports or online with their reports. And person one, the first person, has 2 minutes to talk about the report and the strengths and what they bring to the team. And the second person just has to listen with an appreciative ear and without saying anything, and just listening at how that person prefers to work, their different working styles, their different team role behaviors. And then person 2 has 1 minute to feed back, react to what person 1 has said. And then they swap over. So the other person has 2 minutes to talk about their Belbin report, what they found, ways in which they prefer to work, and the other person feeds back. And sometimes that is the start of really understanding difference and using the Belbin terminology to really make this sort of depersonal. I don't think that's the right word, but instead of saying, and that's what makes me, you can actually use the team role terminology to make that conversation a lot easier.
Most definitely. And something else that can be really helpful is if someone has got an issue, and particularly I would say if it's a manager who has got someone that they have got some difficulty with or are going to have to deal with, and there's some team role understanding there, it can be really helpful for that, let's say manager in this case, to bounce some of the way that they want to address the thing with someone else who has that team role before going and dealing with the live situation. And certainly on leadership courses, that's something that people find really useful. We actually make sure that you get the chance to think about, now I understand more about these team roles, I understand more about myself and the way other people work, then I think of a really difficult situation and think about the characteristics. You don't necessarily know exactly the team role at that point necessarily, but what are the characteristics? That sounds like, and then someone else who's on the training course who has got that team role can help to give some guidance, some suggestions.
Some insights. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I was trying to avoid that word.
Sorry.
but absolutely. It can be so helpful in that way.
Can't it just?
Okay.
So let's go back here. So I think there's a couple more we'd like to explore, but a lot of people brought up the idea that the monitor evaluator and the plant are also, there can be some difficulties then. Of course, that's what we saw in the original work, didn't we, at Henley? It's just what the Apollo teams, where they that tended to be the plant monitor evaluators together, and the plants were coming up with, look at this idea, look at this idea, and the monitor evaluator was saying, no, that won't work. And so there could be a lot of friction when working together.
Yeah, so, and actually, if you're talking about the monitor evaluator, someone else said with Shaper, yes, definitely with plant. I mean, lots of these each way round. We won't keep saying that because it's a fact. Let's look at the coordinator. And I wonder whether this is perhaps not such an obvious one of what we think as being quite opposite to that person who's good at clarifying that end goal in broad terms. That was a clue. Yeah, Shaper.
They can do.
And Emmy. Oh, sorry, that was Emmy who's doing Choose Soul Christmas as well.
I love that, Pam. Thank you. Okay. Resource investigator, specialist.
In fact, specialist is the one that we say officially, because the coordinator, in a way, is a generalist to some degree. I mean, they're very good at organising other people, but it's that generalist and the specialist. These two, although they look at the world from a very different perspective, don't always understand one another, but in fact, they usually appreciate how much they need one another. So although you can have some difficulties with approach, quite often it's less extreme than it is with some of the others, because what you've got is the coordinator saying, oh, I need to have some real depth of knowledge about something here. So actually tapping into the specialist for that. And a specialist who, as Joe was saying, they love learning. They are just like, want to absorb that knowledge and information. They also want to be seen as the go-to person for expertise. So effective specialist is going to know that quite often if they can go through a coordinator, that coordinator can help to disseminate what they're saying more widely, more broadly. So that is a very complementary relationship. All these opposites, in fact, complementary, but often they realize it a bit more, I would say.
Perfect. Thank you, Deborah.
Are you going to say another one there, or we go on to the next? I'm going to just pick up.
Well, I was just going to say, Deborah, that sometimes we talk about having a crystal ball and being able to predict where there could be, let's use the word, potential difficult working relationships by being able to get everybody's reports, understanding them, and yes, just almost plotting them. But sometimes you can get the team to do that prediction themselves. And again, another top tip running a session, and obviously you people who are accredited, you know how to do this, is putting the team roles around the room. Obviously we could do this a lot easier a couple of years ago. So we've put like big A2 posters of each icon around the room, and we get everybody to go and stand by their top team role. And what would happen is that you'd start saying, oh, okay, yeah, this is me. Oh, you're over there. There'd be a lot of laughter about where people are standing in the room. And suddenly, I don't know about you, Deborah, but I've seen light bulb just go, oh, this is why we work in the way that we do, because we're very different. We're very opposite. They're waving at each other across the room. I now get it. So sometimes, and obviously you can then get them to stand by their secondary team roles, their bottom team roles. There's a whole exercise in that. But sometimes that prediction comes from the team, which is really powerful. When they can say, that's why you're so fed up being such a, shaper, because I'm constantly driving and you're listening to people. Wow. Oh my goodness. That's why we sometimes have an issue.
And absolutely. And I think that is coming back to as well. Sometimes you'll find that someone is on that wall that's like the people wall, let's say, everyone else on thinking and action. And it's just what you say. But of course, it's also about how does that relate to the work that they're doing? What's the purpose of that team? And what does that look like? Not just in general terms always, but I completely agree with you that I think it can be, you have to also manage this carefully, because it can sometimes be quite emotional for some people.
Yes,
I certainly was working with a team where there was a situation where one person was on one wall and really the rest of the team, and I can't remember the exact numbers, I think there were about 9 people in the team, and it was very emotional, but it said so much about what the issues were. This was someone who'd come into this team and wasn't regarded by the other people as one of us. They were very much needed, because
I bet
other people have those roles. Before we go on, I realized there was one opposite that we haven't quite done yet. So I just wanted to, if I may, just pop back to that. So if we're looking at resource investigator, so when Joe was telling you about that, it's that energy, that connectedness, talking to people. Which would you say is going to be the opposite of that? Monitor evaluator could be, absolutely, and completer finisher. Yeah, those are the two most, the most extreme, I would say, is the completer finisher, because what you have there is it's a real clash point in my experience with teams, don't you find, Joe, that where you've got the resource investigator, what they're saying is, why are you fiddling about with the detail? It's good enough. Leave it at that point. You can't say it's just good enough to a completer finisher. The completer finisher, their frustration with the resource investigator. Why can't you finish one thing first? Why can't you hand in the information? Whatever. So there's a real built-in potential for difficulty there, I would say, and it's quite extreme. But someone else has said monitor evaluate again. Yeah, most definitely.
I feel that one quite a lot, actually, because I've got very high resource investigator. I don't know if anybody's aware of that. No, not at all. I work very closely with Nigel Belbin, who's very high monitor evaluator. I know when I first started at Belbin, I would be bouncing up the corridor to his desk going, I've got a brilliant idea, right? What we should be doing is this. And he'd just go, no. Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Have you thought about the other? And I remember always walking back down the corridor, always feeling slightly, that's not worked. And then it takes a while to understand that it's not just doing that just to say no, but actually they were really awful ideas. And I didn't need to listen to him. But once realizing that there could have been some conflict to start with, but then I became more prepared and had all of the things thought through first. So it's an interesting combination, really is. Okay, so it's not just, is it, about opposites though? That's not just where these difficult relationships can come in.
Oh, hierarchically is absolutely so much of an issue, because actually, using the example Joe just gave, if your resource investigator, especially in those early days, was coming up against Nigel Belbin's monitor evaluator, it's thinking about which other parts of you, other roles do you have that you could use to relate to him. But it's also, if he is the person who you are reporting to, that's very different. You'd use your resource investigator in a different way to someone who is a colleague of yours and working with you, or someone who works for you. I mean, it's those hierarchical relationships are absolutely vital, and not just in work situations, actually. I mean, I know you've spoken about like the way that you, I won't say manage, but deal with one of your, say, teenage daughters, and what the difference.
It makes a difference. It makes a real difference, doesn't it? So we've got lots of things coming in here when you're looking at different difficult relationships. We've got people who are very different. We're looking at the extremes. Sometimes just being able to feel what it's like in the other person's shoes can help by having that communication, understanding about where the other person's coming from. We've also got the hierarchical relationship as well. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a sec. But other times, I think there can be conflict. There can be difficult working relationships when we have similarity. I think sometimes when we are working with people who are very similar to ourselves, you'd think that that would be a perfect combination, but sometimes it's not, is it?
Depends on which roles, doesn't it?
I suppose it does, yes.
But yes, absolutely. In fact, why don't we ask, which roles do you think it would be really problematic to have lots of in the majority of teams?
I could have put money on that being the first. No, fantastic. Yeah, Shaper seems to be a common theme at the moment, Deborah. Shapers working together. What do you think?
Yes. For sure. Think about it. It's the most competitive. It's the most ambitious of the team roles. So yes, inevitably, there's the potential for quite a lot of conflict and vying. And it's usually really obvious as well. I know we use that expression of blood on the walls, but it's what can really happen there. But I noticed that someone else was saying plants, like a lot of plants. And it's true, going back to the original research as well, the teams that had a number of plants in did no better than the teams that had no plants in. Because if you've got a number of plants, you've got ideas and ideas and ideas. And that's all it is. Now, I actually used to work for an organization where we had advanced research and development. Everyone had brains the size of planets, and large numbers of them were plants. There was a reason for therefore having lots of plants. But in the main, you want to make sure that you don't have too many of these clusters. And so, as someone said, you've got just loads and loads of resource investigators. It's great fun.
That's brilliant.
Party, but what gets done? And you can argue this different ways. I mean, if you have too many completer finishers, what you've got is each completer finisher wanting to set their own standards and do things their way, and that can be difficult as well. So any clustering, too many team workers and you don't get decisions, you get a supportive environment. So basically, it's not going to work well if you have too many of particular team roles.
And so if you had just a twosome, say, so you had two people who had high shaper working together, or any of the team roles, actually, what advice would you give? Because I think, again, it's going back to that awareness. I mean, we're talking just about single role relationships, and we can talk about multi-role sort of later on, because that has an impact as well. But it's the awareness. I like the whole idea of introducing it's almost like you want a button that you press when you're working with somebody, and you're saying, I'm going to press that when we both get too shapery, when we both get too I don't know, planty or whatever, and you actually are very conscious that suddenly that similarity is beginning to cause problems.
Yes, that's usually much easier, isn't it, when there's a third party involved as well. But I think it comes back to the language of, you know, we don't want that to sound too much of a mantra, but it really makes a difference. If people have got the Belbin reports and they have an understanding of what the roles are, if you've got two people working together and they're similar, then usually that means they have the understanding. So you can bring it to the surface, can't you? And then perhaps they can look at, okay, what's my second team role, or what's my third team role? Can I, in this particular, can we have a deal about it? And so, for example, Joe and I actually have some similar team roles.
We do,
but we know that, and so I tend to, I mean, not as strong a shaper as she is anyway, but I would tend to hold back on that and perhaps be doing more of the coordinator or bring my specialist hat in at those times. So we know how it works, and that's what you want to get people to. Of course, emotional intelligence, I've noticed one of the comments coming in, is very much a part of this, and it's that real willingness to be self-aware, I would say.
Isn't it just? I'm just going to close screen there because I think we've come to a good point. So we looked really at the language of Belbin. We've looked at those opposites where there can be potential problems within the working relationships, and we've looked at those similarities and where there may be issues there as well. And the key thing is communication, it's understanding, it's using Belbin as a language to, and also to predict, rather than waiting for it to happen and erupt in front of you or whatever. It's that prediction. It's saying, well, I'm about to work with X. Let's see about the way that they behave. Do they have a Belbin report? Can I sit down with them? Can we work out the best way that we allocate work to ensure that we have the best possible chance of working better together? But what you were talking about before, Deborah, you talked a little bit about hierarchy. You talked a little about the differences between whether or not somebody is the manager, a colleague, or is being managed by. And that can have a real difference out on the outcome of a working relationship, can't it? So do you know what I've done? I've done a little bit of prep. I hope that's okay. Get me. I'm going to share my screen again because you can tell it's getting near Christmas. So what we've done is we've looked at, and I'm sure a few of you are familiar, but some of you won't be, what we call working relationship reports. What are working relationship reports? Well, once people complete their Belbin self-perception inventory and get the feedback from at least 4 people that they work with, and they each have their individual reports, this individual report gives them 13 pages of advice and understanding about how to play those 19, which ones they have more of an affinity for, which ones perhaps colleagues have told them they have an affinity for and they didn't even realize. They have lots and lots of wonderful advice in there. But once you have these, you can put these reports together and you can produce a working relationship report where you specify whether or not somebody is the boss, the colleague, or is managed by the other person. And these tools are fabulous, I think, for the manager. And we had a question earlier on in the Q&A from Gloria. How do managers help with the conflict within their team? And I'd always say, bring up these reports because they are a great starting point. So let me just share my screen, and I'm going to, crikey, which one did I want? I think I want that one. And I'm going to click share. So here we have Joe Pink. Can you see that, Deborah? Perfect. Yep. We've got Joe Pink and Peter Green. And this is their data together. And Joe Pink is the manager of Peter Green. So Joe Pink is in the blue. So you can see top team are there as coordinator, then shaper, then resource investigator, very little specialist or there. And then Peter, top role there, team worker, also resource investigator and completer finisher. So with Joe Pink being the manager of Peter Green, would you say this would be a harmonious relationship, Deborah? What would your crystal ball say? Of course, what I am going to do is bring up the answers in a second, but what do you think?
Yes, so what we've got here, of course, is we can see that we have someone who is going to be probably not needing to be pushing themselves forward so much, except that, no, we do have some absolute similarity on the resource investigator, but we've got the coordinator shaper and a combination in one person of coordinator shaper. They want to be in charge. So they want to be pushing things forward and being able to specify and to then call upon the complete or finish attendances of, in this case, the Peter Green. And what you've got here, oh, sorry, I just was moving my cursor and I realized that you can't see that.
Oh, do you want me to bring it up?
It's fine, thank you. That's easier seeing that the team worker, if you look, the team worker is the #1 team role for Peter, and the number one team role for Joe is this coordinator. So both people oriented, but it's about Joe being able to probably call on Peter to have that understanding, but not minding. So the profile we've got for Joe is not going to mind some conflict and addressing issues. What we've got for Peter is someone who's going to be less comfortable with conflict and wanting to then smooth things over afterwards. So that could be very useful, and it could be an effective relationship with those two.
You see, I think we ought to have you recorded, Deborah, on the corner of these reports so that we can just say play to what this is going to look like. But because we can't have that, obviously, we have got some text here that will show, let me just zoom out a little bit, that says just that. So looking at this combination, has potential to be successful, looking at those interpersonal communications. And obviously best results is if Joe can fulfill Peter's need for encouragement and purpose. But then we look at those second team roles, again, a good working pair, especially with fast moving. It's because, as long as Joe can provide the discipline and pressure that Peter needs, while Peter can think on his feet when required. So we're only commenting on the top 2 team roles there. And obviously we're a wonderful mix of all of these roles. Other bearing things can come into bear here, but let's just think that's a really useful thing to have in front of us when we're looking at perhaps putting 2 people together.
And in fact, if I can just say, I think that once people have that real, so we know we've got accredited people here as well, so really understand this much more. But once you've got that real understanding, we've got as you said, the top #1 team role for each is in that first paragraph, and then the second for each is in that second paragraph. But there's so much more to it here. We can actually, we're just giving an overview, but we can really use this and look and see what issues might be. Exactly, someone saying, you've got low monitor evaluator here, so we can understand that. In fact, they might start doing something and be working effectively together in that way, but is it the right thing that they're even moving to because of the lack of their need? So it's all, there's a richness which we haven't got time to go into now on each of these, but that's what I mean. I think that being able to therefore look at these, well, I'll pick up on that at the end, actually, manager. But so just knowing that we've got different hierarchical arrangements.
Absolutely. So we've got Joe Pink here as the manager of Peter. Now, if we look at it again, let me just zoom out so we can look at all of this. It's exactly the same graph, but the relationship has changed. So again, it's saying on those top team roles, it's got the potential to be successful, good teamwork, mutual support. Only pitfalls may be some proneness to complacency, risk of too much chat, not enough action potentially. But looking at those second team roles, again, as colleagues, they're going to make a good working pair, quite dynamic. Each party may take a few knocks, but it shouldn't matter as long as it's taken in the right spirit. So this is exactly the same graph, but looking at how the interaction of those team roles changes depending on the relationship. And then here we have the next one, which is Peter being the manager of Joe, exactly the same graph, but look, on the basis of the top team roles, this team role comment may counter difficulties, as Joe Pink may be conscious of a lack of direction and decisiveness from Peter Green. And looking at the second team roles, the duo could find it challenging to work together, as Joe may prove over-provocative at times, and that Pete will have to handle Joe carefully to ensure that Joe does not try to take control. So these reports can have real insight into the different working relationships and the different hierarchies and what impact that does have. Where could that difficulty arise? Where maybe that wonderful relationship arise?
And you know what can be so helpful is if a manager is looking to understand them with each of the people in their team. That's one way. Another is, imagine for a moment, you're the manager and you've got two people working together. Perhaps then they were the colleagues one, and or maybe one of them is slightly more senior. What you have to take into account as the manager is, how am I going to help these two people who've got a relationship which at some level should be working well, but we know there's some areas where there could be a bit of vying, for example. And what, as a manager, what is my own understanding and what's my team role? So how am I going to use this to help me to understand what's going on and to, let's say, mediate or to manage the situation there? So I just think I love these reports.
Aren't they? They can open up whole conversations. And it is, again, it's that prediction. This may not happen, but and especially if you're recruiting into a team, if you're recruiting into a team, this makes such a difference, just to be aware of this. And like I said, conflict is good, actually. You know, relationships that aren't all harmonious can be really productive, but it's knowing it and understanding it and using the Belbin terminology to be able to look at it without it becoming personal. So we've looked at the opposites, we've looked at similarities, we've looked at hierarchies and looked at those working relationship reports, which are really, really useful. I want to show you this page, Deborah, which I think is quite useful. This comes from the individual report. So somebody who's completed the self-perception inventory, they know themselves. But then what they've asked is ask 6 people to feed back on them using the observer assessments. And the observer assessments take about 2 minutes, and they're a list of words, list A, which relates to the strengths of the team roles, and list B, which relates to the allowable weaknesses of the team roles. And people have to tick if they see that word in abundance in that person when they're working with them. And this helps to inform the individual report and give you so much useful advice. But you also get this page, which is so incredibly useful. Let me just go here, and then go on to this next page. So what it does, it gives you a whole list of words that the people have ticked and how many times they've ticked them. Now, if you had 6 observers, what you can do is you can actually give some of the words a double tick. So actually each score is out of 12, isn't it, if you have 6 observers, because potentially they could all given a certain word 2 ticks to make that 12 there. So this is an interesting one, Joe Pink, is that actually the top word there, the top word ticked by their observers is in italics, which means it's related to one of the weaknesses of the team roles, one of those potentially allowable weaknesses of the team roles. And in this case, it's impatient. And impatient has been given 11 out of 12 ticks by their observers. So what does this mean? This needs to be taken into consideration, doesn't it?
Absolutely does. And I have to say, it's quite unusual. I mean, I've had plenty of them over the last umpteen years, but it is relatively unusual.
This is an extreme example. I doctored this.
Yes, but I actually had one, you see, we were discussing this, that was really similar to this just fairly recently. And it was, in a way, for the person, they said, yeah, well, of course, you know, you'd be impatient if you worked with that group of people. So they were kind of confirming it. But of course, that does mean that you are going to use that to get the person to reflect on, to understand, why is it they're being like that? What are the triggers? And that can really help to have the conversation. And if they are willing to share, and they don't have to necessarily share, but if they're willing to then share that, in this case, it's not a case of, oh, which person said that? Because usually it's non-attributable. In this case, this individual could work out that everyone must have ticked it at least once. But what does that mean for them? So can we then, and that's when you can use it, you can move things forward to, what are you going to do about it? You know, if the person said, well, I don't want to do anything about it, that's saying a lot about them anyway. Most times, except for a particular someone we spoke to a little while ago, but most times people would want to look at strategies. So you can then help them to think about, what does that mean? Are there strategies? Can they find ways of not being quite as much like that? But think about it. you can stop and think potentially the type of team roles that some other people might have to find and to really notice someone as being impatient. So if, for example, like you were saying earlier, all of you, if I'm a completer finisher, I want to take a little bit of time doing something. If someone is saying, well, can you hurry up a bit? I'll really experience that as impatient. If I'm a monitor evaluator, I can't rush into things because I won't make the right decision. So it might be that impatient has come up higher there than if, for example, it was just other shapers who were commenting. So
Absolutely.
we can use this in that way.
Absolutely. And sometimes you have those what we call like orphan words up there. And sometimes they're not related to any of the team roles. They're just there. And again, it's really important to be aware of those. And again, this can start the dialogue that you have when you are looking at people to why potentially some of their relationships aren't working as well as they should. Now, I'm just going to stop sharing that, because one thing we have briefly talked about, Deborah, we've got about 5 minutes to talk about this, is when you first meet somebody, you tend to have what we'd call a single role relationship. We tend to, this is me, this is my best suit on, these are my strengths, and the relationship can be slightly one-dimensional. The more you get to know people, the more you get to understand what their behaviors are and your behaviors are, we get what we call more of a multi-role relationship, where we're playing different roles to be able to get the most out of relationships. And I think sometimes that's what we're looking to get to when we're looking at managing difficult relationships, is what you can do. You can just both, as your opposites, just refuse to move. You could just say, no, this is who I am. I am not going to move. I do not see this relationship as working or going forward. Or one person, I see it as a bit of a dance sometimes, goes to their secondary role, goes to their tertiary role to see how they can actually get that relationship to be as productive as possible. It does mean using your other roles to be able to do that. And it does mean a great deal of self-awareness to understand how by moving, you are able to form a more productive relationship.
Exactly. We call that sacrificing, actually. You're sacrificing, you're taking a hit for the team, flexing, if you like. It's like, which other parts of myself can I use, and would it be productive to use and useful to bring forward? I'm not changing myself completely, but so that's why, as Jo said, it's going to be one of the roles that you have within your top few, probably, because, yes, we can all say I can be all of them, but actually we can't be all of them well. And so using and understanding enough about what constitutes a really positive example of one of the team roles, and can I bring that forward in this case? And what makes it most helpful is whether it's a one-on-one relationship or a team, if that is then spoken about openly. So if someone can then say, well, look, I know that for what we're doing now, it's going to be more helpful if I can call upon my monitor evaluator, and sort of flex into that because I've got it as there as possible. But that means everyone else has to try and help me in that way. And so again, it's about the managing, as you said at the very outset, Jo, it's managing those relationships, because I then can say, right, if I am doing a bit more of the monitor evaluating, you're going to know that I'm going to say, I need a bit longer on this project to be able to look things through and spend a bit of time analysing it. So don't then, the rest of you, have a go at me for not moving quickly. That's counterproductive.
Absolutely. And I think it's, as always, it starts with self, isn't it? The more self-awareness we have of our strengths, and we have more than one, we have many strengths. We tend to have strengths about 2, 3, 4 of these team roles, 2 or 3 of them we're sort of okay. And the other ones we really just need to delegate. But the more we understand about ourselves, the strengths that we're having, understanding as well the effect that we have on others, and then we understand what's our opposites. We understand the team roles of the people that we're working with. We can start with these single relationships. But then as time progresses, what we need to be able to do is dance that tango, because otherwise relationships do get stale. You want to be able to get the most from it and being prepared to change and flex is a really important thing to be able to do, real important skill, but you can't do that unless you have that language and understanding of yourself in the first instance. It's very difficult to do all of this without that real understanding of ourselves and of others. And I say Belbin makes that wonderful language to make it just a little bit easier.
And sorry, I'm very, very briefly here, but I'm just in a way agreeing with what you said, but I think to say, coming back to that difference, if the difference can come to the fore, very often what that means is that there will be different ways of looking at the work or what you're trying to achieve. And it means that you've got more potential to succeed. It's really beneficial for the individual and the team, and it can actually strengthen relationships. Because if you have gone through that sort of dance, as you were talking about, Jo, and you've understood a bit more about each other and a wider range of aspects of each other, it actually strengthens things and the way that you can work with your other colleagues. So it's that cliche of a win-win, but I really think that it is.
Absolutely. And remember, we change over time as well. The relationship you have, with somebody 10 years ago is very different to now. And it's different because probably the work that you're required to do, which changes, is different. We change and our behavior changes. So it's good to keep up to date with not just expecting that a relationship that used to work is always going to work. We need to ensure that we keep talking about it, and we keep talking about what it is that may be potentially causing some problems there as well.
Someone new coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, actually, just thinking about it, just because of work I was doing a little while ago with some salespeople, is actually quite very effective salespeople are the ones who are really able to flex depending on the person they're selling to. That's a wonderful example of not just being sort of very single relationship, but working out what's the best way of moving to get the most out of that relationship. Okay, crikey, we're at an end. We're at an end, Deborah. So what have we looked at over the last hour? We've looked at difficult working relationships. We've said they're not there to correct, they are there to manage. They're there because sometimes conflict can be really healthy. You may not always see conflict and difficult working relationships. It's not always fisticuffs by the water cooler. It can be that nothing's being said. It can be something that's below the surface. It's not always obvious. But what we can do is we can start understanding ourselves, understanding others, understanding where the differences lie. Try and think about what it might be in their shoes. Try and understand what it may be like working with yourself if you're, seeing it from a different perspective as well. Looking at those opposites, looking at similarities. Where we are just incredibly similar, and why is that potentially causing problems? Have a look at the hierarchy. That could be an issue, or that definitely needs to be taken into consideration. And look at those observer words. Look to see if there's something just at the top there, which may be something we really, really need to talk about. And look about the difference between how you can change your roles to try and get the most out of your working relationships. Crikey, there's so much there. What we would love you to do is to go now and actually get your Belbin report if you've got one. If you haven't, go get one, and think about yourself and think about the people that you work with, so that you can start the beginning of next year fully aware of your strengths, fully aware of the strengths of the people that you work with, and you can start 2022 with the best working relationships that you possibly can.